Okay, welcome to your first video lesson on, well, an introduction and a background to the situation at the end of World War I and the negotiations of the Treaty of Versailles. So we're going to look at the motives of the big three countries. You'll probably and should know at this point that France, Great Britain, and the United States were effectively the victorious allies. Of course, the Italians were on their side and would play a moderate role in terms of the outcome of the final conference and the peace treaties. However, the big three powers were that of the United States, France, and Great Britain, defeating primarily Germany and its ally Austria-Hungary in the war. Now, this lesson, of course, goes through a PowerPoint which has quite a bit of stuff on the exam, and we're just going to skip right over those and look at the motives of the big three. Now, the big three are the individuals who lead each of the countries. Now, of course, there's in Britain, David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister. In France, there's Georges Clemenceau, and the President of the United States is the idealist Woodrow Wilson. Now, background to the First World War, okay? We didn't cover this in class, so let me just give you a little bit of background, where we really start here. So the war, basically, known as the Great War in those days, had devastated Europe. 20 million men had died, which was twice what had happened in just about any other war previous. Again, double that wounded. So obviously the casualties in this First World War were incredibly high. The 4 years of fighting, especially France, had really churned up huge tracts of land in the northern France and western Belgium, and along the frontiers of Germany and Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the Balkans. So a good portion of Europe was destroyed. European civilization, as Margaret Macmillan calls it, the confidence that Europeans once had in themselves had been fundamentally shaken to their core. The Europeans of 1919 had a very real feeling that they had destroyed not just the physical parts of their civilization, but their very political, social, and economic structures. In many ways, we're looking for a redo, to press a reset button, try to make things better, at least, try to answer for the costs of the war with a peace settlement that would bring not only lasting peace, but a better world. The World War I also reshaped empires. Russia really started down the path of revolution in 1917, and the old regime collapsed. Parts of the great Russian Empire started to break away. In the Caucasus, people such as the Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Georgians tried to set up independent states. And the Caucasus are the mountains to the southwestern part of Russia along the Black Sea. In the Ukraine, for a brief period of time before they were recaptured effectively by the Russians, they briefly had their own independent government. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania fought for their freedom. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the enormous empire that occupied great tracts of South and Eastern Europe, had for basically in 4 years collapsed. This space falls into pieces in the last month of the Great War, and what you get in the end is a collection codified in peace treaties of a number of new independent countries from the remnants of the old Austria-Hungary. The German Empire collapses. The monarchy, led by the Kaiser, disappears, and it's replaced in the last days of the war by a republican government, which is a democratic government, of course, without a king. Now, the big three leaders, as I mentioned, are the people here on the picture. You have Clemenceau of France, Wilson of the United States, and Lloyd George of Great Britain. All three of these were the leaders of the victorious countries in this war, and as such, they sought the ability to reshape the peace in the way that they chose. Now, the characteristics of each of these individuals and what they wanted in their countries' sort of demands, considering the horrors they had experienced in the war, will very much shape the nature of the peace settlement that is to come. So let's look at these people individually. The first one, of course, is Georges Clemenceau. He's the French Prime Minister. He's nicknamed the Tiger. He's a harsh negotiator. He's tough, uncompromising. He's unforgiving, especially towards Germany. And as he basically, in this way, resembles the attitudes of most Frenchmen who had saw, and probably actually, if you look at the Allies, there's no denying that the French suffered more in terms of land, and most particularly the majority of the fighting took place in France, but also in terms of the amount of people lost. This is also, interestingly enough, and importantly to note, the second time Germany had attacked France. In the 1860s, France had actually lost the Franco-Prussian War to the Germans. And the Germans imposed a relatively harsh peace treaty on the French at that particular time, which saw them lose a large area of eastern France known as Alsace-Lorraine to the Germans. So at the end of this war, with France victorious over Germany, there's a massive call politically at home for revenge on Germany for not only the war, the First World War, but also sort of taking into account the actions of the Germans over the previous 50 years. And the French people demanded a harsh peace. On the other side of the ocean, you have the President Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is an interesting man. He reluctantly allows the U.S. to go to war in 1917. The U.S. doesn't really get majorly involved until 1918, and as such, the Americans suffered probably the fewest casualties and were the least touched by this war. They actually benefit greatly because they sold many of their industrial goods through this war. But all that notwithstanding, Woodrow Wilson comes from a generation of American politicians, particularly on the Democratic left, known as the progressives. And as such, these people want a more progressive, fair society. He felt basically that World War I was in part caused by the Allies and their competing empires, and he sought to impose what he calls his 14 points. His 14 points were sort of developed, well, they weren't sort of, they were developed by Woodrow Wilson to address the issues that in his eyes started the war. He wanted to create a world and saw that idealistically the peace treaty as a potential to implement these 14 points and to make a better world. He would run, of course, headlong into the opposition of the French and the people of the United Kingdom, who didn't exactly see the world in the sort of through the rose-colored glasses of Woodrow Wilson. But we'll look at his 14 points a little bit later. The other person, and probably painted as the moderate, whether that's true or not, is the Prime Minister of Great Britain, the Welshman David Lloyd George. He realizes very quickly in 1917, 1918 that they're probably going to win the war, and a mood of revenge is pretty much ripe in Britain. They had not quite suffered as much as France, but you're still looking at 1 million casualties for the British and their empire. Lloyd George wins an election against Asquith in 1918 on the backs of the promise to make Germany pay, so that he would go to this peace conference and force Germany to pay for their war. Britain, of course, had some areas of it damaged. The Germans had bombarded coastal towns. They had sunk British shipping. They had done, of course, an incredible the British Army had suffered incredible casualties, especially in the early days of the war fighting the Germans. And as such, the British government, and rather the British people and the government have reflected, weren't necessarily totally in the mood to give Germany a compromise in this peace treaty. His biggest concern, though, however, was the global standing of Great Britain. Britain, of course, is now the country with the largest global empire. And he wants to protect that and perhaps expand it. Britain's really at the height of its powers in the time before the First World War. And David Lloyd George is sort of bent on ensuring that Britain does not step down from its mantle as the global superpower, and also potentially expands Britain's position in the world. So he really is hoping to preserve the empire and help Britain grow economically. Now, France has a very interesting perspective. Clemenceau wants to achieve a peace that would ensure the future security of France. We cannot underestimate at any point here the degree to which the French people were apprehensive about having a strong and powerful Germany on their border, and they were rightfully apprehensive. Don't forget, again, as I mentioned earlier, that France had been attacked by Germany twice in the span of about 50 years. If Germany was sufficiently weakened in the eyes of the French, in the eyes of the French politicians, it would be unable to threaten the peace and in the future. Now, of course, the reasons he had to worry are the fact that Germany and France share quite an extensive border. This border doesn't have a natural frontier or natural block, such as a river, which prevents armies from crossing it, or at least bottle up on a bridge. This border is sort of drawn arbitrarily in some people's minds along the map. The invasion of France in 1914, again, is the second time Germany had invaded. So there is a lot of acrimony and a lot of tension here. not to mention the fact that the French are very conscious of the fact that their sacrifice was the greatest of the Allies, and they have a national desire for revenge. The Germans don't help their cause in the eyes of the French. When the Germans leave France in 1918 as their armies retreat, they deliberately destroy anything of value. They destroy coal mines, they destroy factories, they destroy all the rail infrastructure, the sidings, the depots, the rails themselves. They destroy every bridge they cross. They burn the towns and pillage the foods. Now, this was really to spite the French because of the nature of how the war went, but in many ways this does not help the Germans' cause. And the French will be very uncompromising towards Germany, and in many cases you can sort of justify that. So when Clemenceau arrives at the conference, which he doesn't have to go far to do because it's in his home city of Paris, he demands several things. He demands permanent disarmament and the disbanding of the German army, navy, and air force. He wants a high level of reparations. That reparations is a term meaning payback, that Germany would have to give money to France, Belgium, and any of the countries that it fought against to pay for their losses in the war. Of course, the debts the French government incurred, primarily on loans from the United States and Britain, were astronomical. And in order to pay these debts, the French government realized they needed someone else to help them. And to get Germany to pay for these debts in the form of reparations can be in actual money or can be in raw material, was key to France's demand. France wants the aforementioned territory of Alsace-Lorraine, which was part of France up until the Franco-Prussian War, returned to them. They want Germany's western region, the Rhineland area, to become an independent state so that France no longer shares a border with Germany. So the Rhine River runs north and south along Germany's western border. It's an area known as the Rhineland, and the French are demanding that this becomes an independent state, which will create a buffer zone, if you will, between France and Germany. And the Saar Basin to the south. This is Germany's primary coal coal-producing region, which feeds the industry, is to be transferred to France, in large part due to the compensation for the fact that France's largest coal-producing areas were destroyed by the Germans at the end of the World War I. So therefore, the French find it natural that perhaps the Saar Basin should be transferred to France. Had these, I guess, demands been met, it would have been a very harsh form of justice. Though it's also interesting to point out the fact that such was the demand for revenge, these wouldn't have been as harsh as some people wanted. The French Prime Minister, Poincaré, wanted Germany broken up into smaller states. He wanted effectively Germany to return to its pre-unification form, a series of smaller states that would no longer pose a threat. Now, it's important to note that if Germany had been dismembered and crippled as the French had wanted, it would not have been in a position to invade 20 years later. All that said, we know for a fact that Germany was not totally dismembered. The United States, let's elaborate a little bit on Woodrow Wilson now. Its experience of the war was very, very different. Of course, it doesn't get in the war until 1917 and doesn't really get itself involved fully until 1918. No American territories invaded. There are comparatively few lives lost by comparison to the British or by comparison to the French. And the war was massively profitable for the American trade, industry, and finance. The Americans do very well by the war. So Wilson himself, the President of the United States, could take a more detached viewpoint. He could stand back. He wasn't emotionally affected to the degree the French and the British were. And he was basically determined to earn a place in history as a peacemaker of a fair and lasting peace. And to do this, he championed his 14 points. And again, as I mentioned, each one of these were drawn up to address, as he saw it, the general causes of the conflict. And his ideals and principles would clash harshly with the self-interested ambitions of the British and the French. Now, here are these 14 points. I'm not going to go into detail, but the primary ones are this. Number one, he wanted free trade. The British had a closed imperial system where that anybody involved in the British Empire could have free trade and access to British goods and vice versa. On the other hand, the Americans did not do well by this because, of course, to sell to the large markets in the British Empire, they had to pay tariffs, and these tariffs made American goods more expensive. Wilson, thinking that the world should be free and open, decides that there should be free trade. And of course, this is not something necessarily that the British and the French people, or countries rather, with large empires will think too fondly of. A couple important other points. He wanted this concept of self-determination, this idea that peoples of different races, people of different ethnic backgrounds should effectively rule themselves. He wanted a Europe that would have a Slav state for the Slavs, a Czech state for the Czechs, a Lithuanian state for the Lithuanians, a Ukrainian state for the Ukrainians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, his principle of self-determination increases the hope amongst a lot of national groups all over Europe and, in fact, all over the world, particularly in areas of Asia and Africa, areas where their peoples were colonized by the British or French. This could potentially be the time where they received their independence and their freedom. However, as we'll see, that doesn't necessarily happen in all cases. His principle of self-determination won't be applied across the board. And lastly, amongst a lot of the smaller other details, the other major one is the fact that he wants a League of Nations, a precursor to today's United Nations, effectively a council or an organization of the nations of the world, which will act to resolve their grievances through negotiation in a peaceful way, and in many ways will act as a world police force should these grievances not be solved, to prevent a war on the scale and the size of World War I ever happening again. And those are the primary linchpins of his 14 points, and we can go into those in a little bit more detail later on. Britain, on the other hand, seemed to share France's desire for a harsh peace. Of course, it suffered direct attacks, not to the extent of the French, but it did. It suffered enormously heavy casualties to the war. It had obviously concerns about the security of France, because if France was yet again compromised. Britain's alliance with France would mean that Britain would again be drawn into a war if Germany and France were to again fight each other. And of course, it's always fearful of a strong pan-European power that would reduce its influence not only in Europe but on the global scale. So therefore, Britain wants Germany's potential to make war reduced, not eliminated entirely, but significantly reduced. Lloyd George has to balance out the fact that any sort of compromise he makes with Germany needs to be weighed against the political implications at home of the British public that is angry and demanding vengeance. So Lloyd George does want Germany to pay some of the cost of the war. He wants also to, interestingly enough, again with an eye on keeping and empowering the British Empire, he would like a lot of Germany's colonies in Africa. So Great Britain in 1919 is an interesting thing. Lloyd George begins to change his outlook. Now, of course, in 1918, he talked of a harsh, punitive peace, but he decides that a more moderate peace is in British interests. Sort of the cooler heads prevail, and as 1918 becomes 1919, and he heads off to Paris in the spring of 1919, he basically sees that the economic well-being of Britain is dependent on trade with Germany and the revival of the German economy. Germany had been Britain's largest trading partner and the largest purchaser of British industrial goods and British manufactured goods until the war. And if Germany regains its economic potential, there is huge potential for British industry to sell into Germany, and this is ultimately a very good thing. He also believed that if Germany lost the Rhineland, it wouldn't be wealthy enough to produce or buy British goods. Now, the Rhineland is home to many of Germany's biggest cities: Cologne, Essen, Dusseldorf, Stuttgart, Hamburg is on the Rhine, on the northern part of the Rhine. What did I miss? Essen. You get the picture. Millions and millions of Germans are there. But also importantly, this is the heartland of German industry. And if the Rhineland was disappeared, if it became an independent state like the French wanted, Germany couldn't afford to buy British goods. The economic driver of Germany is in that region. He also believed that reparations, if too significant, would also check Germany's economic recovery because it would take away money used for investment, take away money that could be used to buy British things, et cetera, et cetera. Not to mention the fact that he was a little bit worried that a weakened Germany could not stop the spread of communism from the East, particularly Russia. For Lloyd George, communism was a greater threat than Germany, and the British government is very fearful of communism. In fact, at about this time, it's making a decision to send soldiers to the Russian front to fight off the communist revolution in what becomes known as the Russian Civil War. So Lloyd George also worries that if the Germans felt it was too harsh, it might give credence to those who wish for Germany to overturn this treaty by force. So Lloyd George and Clemenceau. Lloyd George is relatively successful in persuading Clemenceau to make concessions. The bottom line is there's no independent Rhineland state, no name to a definite high reparation sum that the French had wanted, so they have sort of a flexible sum. The Saar Basin was not to be transferred to France, and an area in eastern Poland known as Danzig would be given to the newly created country of Poland in the eyes of many of the peacemakers. But he realized that this area of Danzig was full of Germans. In fact, it was almost 100% Germans, and to give it to the new country of Poland would create national resentment and potentially lead to conflict between Germany and Poland. For Britain, these concessions had to have the added benefit that France, of course, would not replace Germany as the dominant power of Europe. If Germany were broken up, then France would rightfully step into the fold and sort of ruin what was a advantageous balance of power. Power is a good thing. However, if it's split three ways, especially in Europe, it's always good that it's shared. Now, Britain had more of a global power. France had more of a European power, as did Germany. Now, with their interest in keeping France and Germany mostly the same meant that each could check each other's power and that Britain could remain a dominant player in the European field. Of course, Britain has a much smaller population than the two. So the treaties that are signed, and there are many, are basically like this. Now, the Treaty of Versailles with Germany, signed on the 28th of June 1919, is symbolic. It's symbolic because it's exactly 5 years to the day of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, which in many people claim started the war. The Treaty of Versailles is signed with Germany. Treaty of Saint-Germain is signed with Austria, the Treaty of Trianon with Hungary, Treaty of Neuilly with Bulgaria, and the Treaty of Sèvres with Turkey. And we'll go into those in great detail later on. Now, what was agreed in the Treaty of Versailles? I'm going to be very brief here. Number one, that the League of Nations, Germany had to accept the constitution of this new organization, a world sort of form, but it actually was excluded from its membership until the late 1920s. Germany would be forced to pay $6.6 billion in reparations. Germany would be disarmed, its army reduced to 100,000 men, very small. There would be no tanks, artillery, or heavy vehicles, no submarines, air force, or navy. They were only allowed 6 capital ships of any type. The Rhineland was demilitarized, not given. There would be no German fortifications, no soldiers allowed in this area. An Allied army of occupation would stay on the west bank of the river for approximately 15 years. Self-determination and the removal of land belonging to Germany, so large parts of Germany were carved out and given to new countries, namely Poland and Czechoslovakia. Alsace-Lorraine, that area that the French had wanted, was returned to France after about 50 years. The Saar Basin was kept in Germany, but administered by the League of Nations for 15 years, when a plebiscite would be held to decide whether it should belong to Germany or France or remain under the control of the League of Nations. German colonies are given to the Allies to look after its mandates. Danzig becomes a free city administered by the League of Nations, and Poland could use the port of Danzig, which prevents it from being a landlocked country. And the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was signed between Germany and Russia in early 1918, was incredibly harsh to the Russians, was made null and void. Many of the punitive settlements on Russia, including reparations and land, were given back to the Russians. Union between Austria and Germany, known as Anschluss in German, was also banned. So the unification of the two German states in the center of Europe was banned forever. So this is what it looks like in the end. And we'll look at this in class, so I'm not going to go into this in great detail. So do take a quick look at it in your PowerPoint. But finally, what you have to know is that the Germans were forced to accept what's known as the war guilt, Article 231. This meant that Germany would accept full responsibility for war. The lawyers in the settlement here believed that Germany needed to accept guilt in order for reparations and the payment of these terms to be legal. And as such, they made Germany accept Article 231, the war guilt. This meant that they were accountable to all damage and that they would have to pay the reparations to the tune, in the end, of $33 billion US. When this was announced, the current German chancellor resigned, the German sailors sunk the remaining German fleet, and Germans refused to believe that they started the war. This would be an incredibly problematic clause and one used by a lot of German nationalists in the ensuing years to blame the British and the French for what happened. So that's the end of the lesson. Make sure you take a good look at that map, review these notes, add anything to it, and I'll see you in class.